Thank you for everything always. Thank you for the love that keeps showing up in my life. Thank you for the grace surrounding my path. Thank you for the hope that feels grounding. Thank you for the comfort in my life. Thank you always for safety in being myself. Thank you always for trust in what's ahead of me. Thank you always for the peace within me. Thank you always for abundance without struggle. Thank you always for greatness that is guiding me. Thank you always for gentleness that guides me. Thank you always for rest that heals deeply. Thank you always for clarity that settles in. Thank you always for growth that feels aligned. Thank you always for reassurance in uncertainty. Thank you always for my confidence. Thank you always for flow replacing resistance. Thank you always for lightness returning to my spirit. Thank you always for grace leading the way. Thank you always for trust deepening daily. Thank you always for abundance meeting me halfway. Thank you always for hope that feels natural. Thank you always for ease replacing effort. Thank you always for balance restoring itself. Thank you always for peace that I can trust. Thank you always for steady alignment. Thank you always for safety in stillness. Thank you always for resilience built with love. Thank you always for calm clarity. Thank you always for resilience built with love. Thank you always for calm clarity. Thank you always for patience woven into my life. Thank you always for grace in every step. Thank you always for softness in my day. Thank you always for abundance multiplying gently. Thank you always for intuition guiding me. Thank you always for presence anchoring me. Thank you always for good energy in my life. Thank you always for abundance becoming my default. Thank you always for trust replacing fear. Thank you always for clarity that feels peaceful. Thank you always for support I can lean on. Thank you always for calm arriving easily. Thank you always for safety in surrender. Thank you always for the courage to keep believing. Thank you always for patience with my own pace. Thank you always for gentle momentum. Thank you always for the abundance I already hold. Thank you always for hope renewing itself. Thank you always for steadiness in uncertain times. Thank you always for reassurance when I need it. Thank you always for love that meets me halfway. Thank you always for grounding me in the present. Thank you always for joy that is rooted in the present. Thank you always for the calm that breathes through me. Thank you always for trust in the process. Thank you always for clarity replacing doubt. Thank you always for compassion towards myself. Thank you always for doors opening without force. Thank you always for rest that feels deserved. Thank you always for confidence that grows quietly. Thank you always for creativity flowing freely. Thank you always for life responding to my gratitude. Thank you always for alignment unfolding naturally. Thank you always for the abundance in my life. Thank you always for the peace I can return to. Thank you always for the safety in my body. Thank you always for safe becoming steadier. Thank you always for progress that feels sustainable. Thank you always for the guidance I can feel in my body. Thank you always for the joy that finds me unexpectedly. Thank you always for the lessons that made me feel stronger. Thank you always for the support showing up right on time. Thank you always for the comfort in the present moment. Thank you always for healing happening in layers. Thank you always for opportunities aligning effortlessly. . Thank you always for trust growing day by day. Thank you always for hope that never leaves me. Thank you always for grace when I need it most. Thank you always for the strength to keep going. Thank you always for balance finding me again. Thank you always for love that feels safe and steady. Thank you always for wisdom earned through experience. Thank you always for calm after the storm. Thank you always for clarity replacing confusion. Thank you always for rest that restores me. Thank you always for every small win. Thank you always for softness returning to my heart. Thank you always for resilience I can trust. Thank you always for peace settling into my body. Thank you always for abundance flowing naturally. Thank you always for patience growing within me. Thank you always for reminding me I am never alone. Thank you always for answers arriving in perfect timing. Thank you always for growth that feels gentle and true. Thank you always for meeting me where I am. Thank you always for protection, guidance, and grace. Thank you always for steady progress even on quiet days. Thank you always for unseen support surrounding me. Thank you always for what is unfolding in my favor. Thank you always for this moment of calm. My default response to life is thank you. My gratitude transforms everything that I see. I am grateful for the breath in my lungs and the beat of my heart. Thank you for this moment exactly as it is. Thank you for this moment and for the peace I find within it. I move through this day with a thank you. I move through this day with ease in my soul. Thank you to my past self for the strength that brought me to this moment. I am grateful for the challenges that sharpen my spirit. Thank you for the abundance that flows to me and the abundance that flows through me. I am grateful for the people who see my light and those who help me grow. The more I say thank you, the more reasons I find to say it. I walk in a state of constant appreciation. I attract kindness and opportunity wherever I go. Thank you for the gift of a new day and a clean slate. I am grateful for the rest I received and the energy I now have. Thank you for the quiet moments before the world wakes up. I appreciate the sun rising. Thank you for the opportunity to try again today. I am grateful for the breath that centers me as I start my morning. I appreciate the comfort of my bed and the roof over my head. Thank you for the food waiting for me in my kitchen. Thank you for the clarity that comes with a new morning. Thank you for this version of me that I am. Thank you for the version of me I am becoming. I appreciate my mistakes for the wisdom they've left behind. Thank you for my curiosity, which keeps my life interesting. I am grateful for my ability to change my mind. Thank you for my ability to change my path. Thank you for the courage I didn't know I had until I needed it. I appreciate the inner voice that cheers me on. Thank you for the patience I am learning to show myself. I am grateful for every level I've experienced this year. Thank you for the boundaries I've learned to set for my own peace. Thank you for the unique light I bring into every room. Thank you for the friends who feel like family. I am grateful for the strangers who smile back at me. Thank you for the deep conversations that nourish my soul. I appreciate the mentors who shared their shortcuts with me. Thank you for the laughter I have in my life. I am grateful for my support system. Thank you for the love I give just as much as the love I receive. Thank you for the pets and animals that offer me joy. Thank you for every skill I have perfected. Thank you for the creativity within me. Thank you for the people in my life who make things easier. Thank you for the income that provides for my needs. Thank you for the income that provides for my wants. Thank you for the weekend that brings balance into my life. Thank you for the discipline that helps me reach my goals. Thank you for the inspiration I find in other people's success. Thank you for the stillness I can access at any time. Thank you for the peace I can access at any time. Thank you for everything that helps me heal. Thank you for my ability to say no without guilt. I appreciate the emotional intelligence I have developed. Thank you for the tears that clear my eyes and my heart. I am grateful for the grace I extend to myself when I am tired. Thank you for the music that matches my mood. Thank you for the music that lifts my spirits. I appreciate every moment that brings me peace. Thank you for the power of my own thoughts to create my reality. I am grateful for the safety I feel within my own skin. Thank you for the strength in my legs that carry me forward. Thank you for the ground beneath my feet and its constant support. Thank you for the beauty of the stars above me. Thank you for my connection to all living things. Thank you for the wealth of opportunities that surround me. Thank you for my needs being met. Thank you for the flow of money into my life. I appreciate the generosity of others and my own ability to give. Thank you for the freedom to make my own choices. I am grateful for the luxuries, small and large, that I enjoy. Thank you for me being in the right place at the right time. Thank you for the beauty of my life. Thank you for the perfect timing of my life. Thank you for the abundance of love, time, and energy available to me. Thank you for every lesson in my life. Thank you for the mystery of life and the joy of discovery. I am grateful for the feeling of being part of something bigger. Thank you for every miracle that happens every single day. Thank you for the wisdom of the universe that guides my steps. Thank you for the energy that connects me to everyone and everything. I am grateful for time and the healing it brings me. Thank you for the beauty that exists even in the most unlikely places. Thank you for the constant state of grace in my life. Thank you for the soul I inhabit and the journey I am on. I am grateful for this exact moment, right here, right now. Thank you always for today meeting me kindly. Thank you for the peace finding its way back to me. Thank you for quiet reassurance in my life. Thank you always for steady forward motion. Thank you always for the support I can feel. Thank you always for everything aligning in time for me. Thank you always for the softness in my nervous system. Thank you always for the strength that feels calm. Thank you always for ease becoming familiar. Thank you always for this breath that I feel right now. Thank you always for gentle clarity. Thank you always for guidance that feels true. Thank you always for patience growing naturally. Thank you always for rest without guilt. Thank you always for life responding kindly. Thank you always for steady abundance. Thank you always for the protection on my path. Thank you always for reassurance arriving easily. Thank you always for alignment unfolding smoothly. Thank you always for calm in my body. Thank you always for trust deepening within me. Thank you always for answers showing up gently. Thank you always for peace returning again and again. Thank you always for every moment of joy in my life. Thank you always for consistency and care. Thank you always for support that feels steady. Thank you always for balance restoring itself. Thank you always for clarity replacing tension. Thank you always for safety in the present moment. Thank you always for abundance without force. Thank you always for calm replacing urgency. Thank you always for grace leading my steps. Thank you always for resilience rooted in love. Thank you always for comfort in routine. Thank you always for hope staying with me. Thank you always for trust becoming easier. Thank you always for peace that feels earned. Thank you always for greatness guiding me. Thank you always for flow returning naturally. Thank you always for rest that restores deeply. Thank you always for faith growing quietly. Thank you always for abundance expanding softly. Thank you always for clarity that settles in. Thank you always for joy that feels grounded. Thank you always for calm confidence. Thank you always for ease in being myself. Thank you always for patience with my journey. Thank you always for peace that I can rely on. Thank you always for reassurance without words. Thank you always for gentler days ahead. Thank you always for love that feels stable. Thank you always for balance between effort and rest. Thank you always for alignment without struggle. Thank you always for softness returning to my heart. Thank you always for support woven into my life. Thank you always for clarity after confusion. Thank you always for trust guiding my choices. Thank you always for ease in each step. Thank you always for grounding moments. Thank you always for abundance in simple things. Thank you always for calm mornings and gentle nights. Thank you always for stability that I can feel. Thank you always for guidance that feels safe. Thank you always for patience becoming natural. Thank you always for peace settling deeper. Thank you always for resilience without hardness. Thank you always for reassurance returning. Thank you always for rest arriving on time. Thank you always for emotional steadiness. Thank you always for abundance that surrounds me. Thank you always for kindness that feels kind. Thank you always for calm replacing worry. Thank you always for safety in slowing down. Thank you always for alignment that feels peaceful. Thank you always for comfort in knowing enough. Thank you always for grace in every pause. Thank Thank you always for peace expanding quietly. Thank you always for life meeting me halfway. Thank you always for the trust that feels embodied. Thank you always for the reassurance I can breathe into. Thank you always for the abundance flowing steadily to me. Thank you always for the rest that feels complete. Thank you always for the patience woven into time. Thank you always for the calm that returns to me. Thank you always for softness guiding my pace. Thank you always for grace without condition. Thank you always for steady inner peace. Thank you always for faith in small steps. Thank you always for alignment becoming obvious. Thank you always for safety in this moment. Thank you always for reassurance becoming familiar. Thank you always for abundance I can trust. Thank you always for the calm strength within me. Thank you always for balance that holds me together. Thank you always for the love that stays within me. Thank you for always meeting me in this moment. Thank you always for calm finding me again. Thank you always for gentle reassurance. Thank you always for what is quietly improving. Thank you always for steadiness in my life. Thank you always for guidance I can trust. Thank you always for ease returning to my body. Thank you always for me being carried through. Thank you always for patience unfolding naturally. Thank you always for peace becoming familiar. Thank you always for rest without pressure. Thank you always for growth that feels safe. Thank you always for answers arriving right on time. Thank you always for the protection surrounding me. Thank you always for clarity without force. Thank you always for support that I can lean into. Thank you always for abundance flowing gently to me. Thank you always for emotional safety. Thank you always for steadiness through change. Thank you always for the gift of now. Thank you always for trust deepening inside of me. Thank you always for calm after uncertainty. Thank you always for reassurance showing up. Thank you always for ease replacing tension. Thank you always for grace guiding my pace. Thank you always for softness returning to me. Thank you always for the stability I can feel. Thank you always for progress without rush. Thank you always for peace that lingers. Thank you always for alignment that unfolds naturally for me. Thank you always for every grounding moment in my life. Thank you always for abundance and simplicity. Thank you always for comfort and consistency. Thank you always for support woven into my days. Thank you always for faith growing quietly. Thank you always for calm strength within me. Thank you always for clarity settling in. Thank you always for patience within myself. Thank you always for balance returning to me. Thank you always for gentleness leading the way. Thank you always for rest that restores me. Thank you always for guidance that feels embodied. Thank you always for peace in my nervous system. Thank you always for reassurance I can breathe into. Thank you always for steadiness in my heart. Thank you always for life responding kindly to me. Thank you always for love that remains. Thank you always and forever. I thank you for joining me here today. Before we end, I'd like to remind you of these facts of life as always. You are supported in every season of your life. You are guided with care. You are safe in this moment and always. You are allowed to rest. You are moving in the right direction. You are surrounded by support in every aspect of your life. You are worthy of peace. You are worthy of compassion. You are worthy of abundance. You are deeply cared for. Know this to be true. Claim it as yours now, always, and forever. I thank you again for joining me here today. If you enjoyed these affirmations, please consider leaving a like, comment, subscribing, and sharing with someone you love. If you'd like to support this channel further, please consider buying me a coffee at the link below. Lastly, and as always, thank you. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you so much for your generosity. Thank you so much for your kindness. I could not do this without you. As always, take care and make a difference.